Hey, what's up, Flannelverse? Neil Orfield here to break down the Dolphins Commanders game in Madrid. This game has a 47.5 total. Miami favored by 2.5. Technically, the home team is Miami here, but again, the game is in Madrid. I'm going to be breaking this game down as usual, starting with quarterbacks, then running backs, receivers, tight ends, defenses, kickers. I am not going to be making lineups on this stream, at least not with Run the Sims, because no ownership projections yet at Run the Sims. Everything else seems to be updated. I think we have all the information we're going to have for this slate. So I'm recording this on Friday afternoon. So yeah, not going to be running the Sims here, but everything else will be just like my usual show breakdowns that I typically do 85 to 90 minutes prior to lock. I'll again position by position looking at defensive matchups, usage trends, coach speak, all that good stuff as I break down the game. If you like the analysis and want to show some support, you can please like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I am trying to get to 6,000 subscribers by the end of the NFL season. You can use all the support I can get. And also, if you want to check out Run the Sims, which again, I'm not going to be running the Sims here right now, but if you want to check it out, you can use promo code Neil to get 50% off your first payment on any NFL product at Run the Sims using promo code Neil. Highly recommend checking it out. Plenty of time to get it. Use it before the Sunday morning game and also the main slate on Sunday. Starting with quarterback, starting with Marcus Mariota. He is 9,800. Looking at his projected ownership, Roto Grinders has him at 60% projected flex ownership, and at captain 9.5%. So we're looking at nearly 70% ownership going to Marcus Mariota overall on DraftKings. In the games that Marcus Mariota has started, the Commanders rank 27th in terms of pass rate over expectation, so more inclined to run when they have Marcus Mariota at quarterback. And then as far as the matchup goes, Miami is the 15th worst matchup for quarterbacks in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position over the past 5 weeks. And so far this year, Marcus Mariota has continued to be a bit of a running quarterback, 24 yards per game, but that includes only 4 starts. So 2 of those are partial games. So the yards per game in starts actually a bit higher than 24 for Marcus Mariota. Also does have 1 rushing touchdown on the season. So still a very capable running quarterback. You can see last year he rushed for 31 yards per game. One game in 2020 rushed for 88 yards. I'm not sure if he still has that in his bag. He might. He's only 32 years old and still showing some ability to run. So certainly running more than your average quarterback. With that said, it is a particularly tough matchup for rushing quarterbacks, negative 2.7. So below neutral in terms of the rush for quarterbacks over the past 5 weeks. Not, too far off from neutral, maybe not enough that we need to be factoring in, but it is maybe worth noting here that it is a slightly negative matchup for rushing for quarterbacks. So ultimately, my takeaway is it's a fine matchup for quarterbacks in general. Like I said, fairly neutral as far as the matchup goes. Commanders more inclined to run it than to pass it with Marcus Mariota, but that does include Mariota running a bit as well. Ultimately, I think 70% ownership seems a bit much. So I would anticipate that I'm going to be coming in underweight to the field when it comes to Marcus Mariota. There are just a couple other spend ups that I'd prefer to get to, but it's not too far off. I do think, he's a fair price tag, a player that I'll have in a lot of my lineups. I just anticipate that I'll be a bit underweight there. On the other side, Tua Tagovailoa is 10,000 projected for just 4.5% captain ownership. So that looks fairly nice in terms of the captain ownership. In the flex, Tua projected for 54% ownership. So getting a bit less ownership overall than Marcus Mariota at just $200 more. On the season, the Dolphins ranked 27th in terms of pass rate over expectation. So also a team that would rather run the ball. But it is a really nice matchup for Tua over the past 5 weeks. The Commanders rank 4th in terms of best matchups for quarterbacks in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. So really nice matchup for Tua Tagovailoa here against the Commanders. So ultimately, factoring in the matchup for Tua Tagovailoa and of course the ownership being lower, I think I'm going to like Tua quite a bit here. Projects fairly well. Now, Tua, not much of a rushing quarterback, averaging just 3.8 yards per game on the season, does not have a single rushing touchdown on the season and hasn't since 2021. So it's been a while since Tua scored a rushing touchdown, doesn't rush for a lot of yards. Makes it easy to know how you want to play Tua. I'm never going to play him naked in a lineup. I'm always going to have at least one pass catcher with him. And when I have Tua Tagovailoa at captain, I'm always going to want him stacked up with probably multiple pass catchers when he is at captain, at least 2 there. You can definitely include Devin Achan in that consideration as a pass catcher. Devin Achan very involved in the passing game. But yeah, I want to have multiple pass catchers when I have Tua in the captain spot. And regardless of where I have him in the lineup, I want to have at least one pass catcher with him. But I would anticipate being overweight to the projected ownership for Tua. He's being projected for sub 60% total ownership, only about 4 to 5% at captain. That looks great. I'm going to be over the field, particularly at captain, on Tua, and I would anticipate having him in more than 60% of my lineups overall. As far as the running backs go, we'll start with the Commanders, and we have 3 running backs to consider on the Commanders. Chris Rodriguez is 6,600, Jacory Croskey-Merritt is 7,000, and Jeremy McNichols is 5,400. As you can see here at Run the Sims, Chris Rodriguez projects the best projection of 9.6. Jacory Croskey-Merritt just a couple points under that at 7.6. And then Jeremy McNichols at 4.7. At Roto Grinders, they have it as Chris Rodriguez at just under 9, Jacory Croskey-Merritt just under 4. So a bit bigger spread here between Rodriguez and Croskey-Merritt. And then McNichols at 6. So he splits the two of them on both sites. It's a middling matchup for running backs against Miami. Over the past 5 weeks, the Dolphins have allowed the 16th most schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game to running backs. Obviously, there was a little while there where it was looking like they were going to be a great matchup for running backs. We saw a few running backs have really good success against the Dolphins, but recently they've really shored up their defense, and it's been a much tougher matchup for running backs recently. As far as how to project Chris Rodriguez, it does appear to be fairly tough on the surface. And both sites, again, have Rodriguez as the best projection here. And I think that is right. It's just a matter of how much we should be projecting Chris Rodriguez for. I just want to note the kind of trend here. He didn't play until week 3. He was a healthy scratch the first couple games of the season. If you just look at his expected fantasy points week by week, started off okay with a 7.5 expected fantasy point, and then it was dipped for several weeks until finally in week 9, Rodriguez had 7.4 expected fantasy points, had a fairly strong role in week 9. And then prior to week 10, Rodriguez was named the captain of the team, and many people projected him to be the starter, the one who was going to get the bulk of the carries. He only had 5.6 expected fantasy points in the game in last week in week 10. So we actually saw a dip in terms of projected fantasy points, only played 35% of the snaps. So you might look at that and think that Rodriguez, maybe didn't produce well enough. He also didn't have that many yards per carry, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of an underwhelming game last week against Detroit. However, it is worth noting he injured himself in the first half, I believe, of that game. So ultimately, if you look at just last week in terms of by quarter for Chris Rodriguez, in the first half, he played 17 snaps. The second half, just 1 snap. So again, he injured his shoulder, but in the first half, he had 6 rushing attempts. He played 50% of snaps in the first quarter and then 90.9% of snaps in the second quarter of that game for Chris Rodriguez. And probably the most promising thing to me is that he ran 44.4% of routes in the first quarter and 75% in the second quarter. Again, if you look at his week by week, his route participation, it has been fairly strong or fairly weak early on in the season. Just 9% in week 1, 23, 19, 3, 10, 0, 20, and then up to 31. So it doesn't look like a big change in terms of the route participation. But then once you actually break it down by quarter, it looked like he was actually fairly involved as a runner. So I don't think it would be wrong necessarily to project Rodriguez even better than the sites have him at. But it's kind of an unknown because we don't know what would have happened in the second half of that game if he didn't hurt himself. But we also have some positive coach speak on Chris Rodriguez. And also some more, lukewarm coach speak as well. So I'll give you the recent coach speak on Chris Rodriguez and the running backs on the Commanders. First of all, prior to that last game on the 6th of November, offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury said, "We have to take what's blocked." I thought that was one thing that Chris Rodriguez did a really nice job of when he came in. We have to take what's blocked, and then the big plays will come. Every time we've asked him to step up, he's played at a high level. On November 12th, so just a couple days ago this week, head coach Dan Quinn said, "Chris Rodriguez injured his shoulder last week, but he's going to be able to play this week. He's one of our most consistent players. We'll lean in on him. He's somebody we all count on." On the 13th, offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury on what has stood out about Chris Rodriguez's development. He said, "I think just consistency in his play. Anytime he's called upon to get the tough yard, he gets it. He puts the ball in the right place. He always finds the hole, and he's going to maximize his opportunities. His teammates respect that, and I know the coaching staff does as well." Now, the most recent quote is, I would say, the most lukewarm. On the 14th, head coach Dan Quinn said on whether Chris Rodriguez will continue to be the lead back or will it be a committee. He said, "We'll lean into a hot hand approach. They all get some carries, but someone usually establishes themselves. It doesn't have to be for the whole year. Sometimes it might just be for that game." So they're saying it will be a hot hand approach. Whether you believe that or whether you know how long you think the leash might be, I would expect Chris Rodriguez to get the start again because again he was named a captain last week. Most of the coach speak has been pretty glowing. I think it makes sense for coaches to say that it's going to be a hot hand approach, and maybe they believe that, maybe it is true. But Chris Rodriguez will probably get the first crack at it and probably get the most opportunities unless one of the other running backs comes out and just looks much better. I would expect that it is going to be Chris Rodriguez getting the bulk of the opportunities. And again, I think it's pretty promising the kind of work that he had early in that game last week, where again he had 44% route participation up to 75% in the second quarter, and was just playing all the snaps, 91% in the second quarter. All of that really promising. Unfortunate that he hurt himself, and then the game was also a blowout, so that kind of makes it tough. Just given the number of blowouts the Commanders have played in recently, it's tough to really read too much into their trends. What would happen in a close game? But it's at least promising to see that Rodriguez got the bulk of the work in the first quarter last week. The flip side, of course, is Jacory Croskey-Merritt, who played just 4 snaps in the first quarter last week, 0 in the second half. So it was just fully the Chris Rodriguez show in the first half last week. Then Rodriguez hurts himself, and it was Jacory Croskey-Merritt at that point, played 9 snaps in each of the third and fourth quarter and had 9 carries in the second half of that game. So if you just look at the box score, it looks fairly close last week between Jacory Croskey-Merritt and Chris Rodriguez. But overall, it was actually Rodriguez getting all the work in the first half, and then Jacory Croskey-Merritt getting all the work in the second half after Rodriguez hurt himself. And then finally, Jeremy McNichols also could be hurt significantly if the route participation for Chris Rodriguez holds true, because McNichols kind of considered the pass catching back there for the Commanders. So if they're going to trust Rodriguez with that work, which again, we have a small sample size, we don't know if that's the way it's trending, but if it trends that way, it would be a negative for McNichols, who again has been the pass catching back for the Commanders. Looking at the expected fantasy points by week for McNichols and also the route participation, we have seen kind of a decline in the past couple of weeks for McNichols. Was kind of picking up throughout the year in terms of expected fantasy points in week 4. That would be 4.5, and then 3.4 up to 6.8, then 5.2, 9 in week 8 expected fantasy points for McNichols, but then dropped all the way down to 0.3 and then 3.7 in week 10. And that's again the week that Chris Rodriguez got hurt in the second half. So they were down a running back and he got back up to 3.7. So kind of seems as though McNichols has been phased out a bit. The route participation was pretty good again in the middle of the season, 40% in week 4, and then 31, 31, 32, 46, 31, but then back down to 19% route participation last week for Jeremy McNichols. And if we look at him quarter by quarter last week, McNichols in the first quarter played 4 snaps, and then 2 in the second, 2 in the third, played all 8 snaps in the I shouldn't say all, played 8 snaps in the fourth quarter of that game, which again was just a total blowout. It does also fit his skill set. So, kind of promising to see that 50% route participation in the fourth quarter. You would kind of expect him to come in and be the pass catching back, getting a lot of work in the fourth quarter of a blowout. But again, that was also with Chris Rodriguez out. So we don't know what it would have looked like if Rodriguez was still in there. In terms of projected ownership, now we'll have to see if this kind of ownership holds on Sunday. As of right now, Roto Grinders has Chris Rodriguez, who's 6,600, projected for 19% ownership. Jacory Croskey-Merritt at 7,000, projected for 2%. And then Jeremy McNichols at 5,400, projected for 7%. At captain, they've got Chris Rodriguez for just under 5%. They've got Croskey-Merritt at 0.5%, and Jeremy McNichols at 1% ownership. So not a ton of ownership going to the running backs on the Commanders. I will say my favorite of the group at these ownership numbers is Rodriguez, just because he's 6,600, was appearing to be the lead back early in that game last week. I think the way the sites have him projected for 9 to 10 fantasy points seems totally reasonable, but also I think you could, just kind of try to forecast what he would be projected for if he had held on to that role that he had in the first half of the game last week, where again he had 6 carries, but also ran a bunch of routes. Wasn't targeted, so that's running routes but not being targeted. Not ideal. You'd like to see some targets come along with it, but it's possible that his role is going to expand even more than we saw last week before the injury. So if he's going to be sub 20% ownership at 6,600 as the seemingly the lead back there for the Commanders, I do think that Rodriguez looks like a fairly strong play. Jacory Croskey-Merritt, 7,000, a bit more expensive, but at 2% ownership, I would want more than that also, because again, the coaches say it's going to be a hot hand approach. We know that Croskey-Merritt does have the ability to break off long runs. We haven't really seen it recently as much, but he has shown the ability to at times, break through and break off for a long touchdown. So he's clearly too expensive for his diminishing role, but if he's going to get 2% ownership, just knowing that they're saying it's going to be a hot hand approach, knowing he has the ability to break one off, I would want to have, double that, at least have 5% or so of Jacory Croskey-Merritt, I think makes sense. And then Jeremy McNichols at 5,400. As a pass catching back, doesn't need to necessarily score. He can rack up some receptions there. The ownership is fairly low at 7%. I would probably say he's my least favorite of the group just because he is 5,400, but he's also shown the ability to break off a long touchdown, and he's involved in the passing game and getting just 7% ownership. So he's probably more expensive than he should be. But I think he's fine at 7%. I think that's kind of about where McNichols should be. So yeah, my favorite would be Rodriguez at these ownership numbers. I do think Jacory Croskey-Merritt is, a fun play at 2% ownership who is very likely to disappoint in a big way at 7,000, but can break one off and put up a big score. And maybe the hot hand approach is real and he can get more work than we're expecting. And then McNichols, kind of an afterthought for me, but at 7% ownership, I think that's about fine. On the Dolphin side, we also have 3 running backs to consider. There is a standout here with Devin Achane as the clear lead back, and then a couple others. Actually 3. You can also consider the fullback Alec Ingold, but we've got Ollie Gordon and Jalen Wright, 2 rookie running backs to consider here as well. But we'll start things off with Devin Achane, and first we'll look at the schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed. This is the 3rd best matchup overall for running backs in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed per game over the past 5 weeks. It's also particularly strong through the air. It's much better than neutral through the air over the past 5 weeks. It is the 2nd best matchup, or tied for 2nd best matchup. But looks like for a running back like Devin Achane, who's very involved in the passing game, really strong matchup here against the Commanders. Achane is being projected for 41% flex ownership and 30.5% captain ownership. I think that makes sense. I think Achane just looks like a fantastic captain play here. This is maybe maybe slightly more than I'd like to be at captain. In a vacuum, he would be my favorite captain play. I think the likeliest player to put up a huge score here at 30.5% ownership, just, compared to everybody else on the slate, becomes less of a priority in terms of wanting to get over the field. But I think 30.5% probably fine for Achane. If you just look at his game log in terms of expected fantasy points, it's pretty consistently high. 21 expected fantasy points last week, 22.6 the week prior to that, 20.6 the week prior to that. Prior to that, there were a long string of games where he did not reach 20 expected fantasy points, but the role is just really strong for Devin Achane. He is very involved in the passing game. 6 targets last week on 76.2% route participation. The week prior to that, 10 targets on 70% route participation. So super involved in the passing game, and also gets a fair number of carries, 22 carries last week, 14 the week prior to that, 18 the week prior to that. So he's really involved as a running back, but also, clears like a wide receiver too as a pass catcher as well. So awesome usage for Devin Achane, and a nice matchup here with the Commanders. Everything looks great. He's projected to, again, be played by about 70% of the field, with 30.5% of that going to captain. I think that's about right. I think I'm going to have a lot of Devin Achane. Again, in a vacuum, he would be my favorite captain. Once you factor in ownership, I have to, kind of think about whether there might be somebody that I like better, with Tua not getting much ownership, Waddle at lower ownership. But I think that he's just an objectively very strong play across the board. Somebody I'll have a lot of in my lineups. And then beyond Achan, it gets a little bit hairier with Jalen Wright and Ollie Gordon, because Jalen Wright was fairly involved in week 10. We saw Jalen Wright get 9 carries. He played just 15% of the snaps, but again, 9 carries in that game. Also, 1 target on just 3.6% route participation. So not like awesome work in the passing game, but 9 carries is pretty significant for Jalen Wright in week 8. But then week 9, he was made inactive, a healthy scratch. Kind of surprised there in week 9, but back to week 10, Jalen Wright did come back and played. And looking at the bi-quarter splits, he played 5 snaps in the first quarter, 3 in the second quarter, 0 in the third, and 2 in the fourth. So he was fairly involved throughout the game. Again, 8 snaps in the first half last week, 5 total carries. So we actually saw some decent usage for Jalen Wright last week. Was not targeted, but did run 17% of the routes, which is just 1 route in the first quarter of that game last week. So, if he gets kind of similar usage this week, again, just 1 total route on the week last week, not super involved, but 5 carries, all of them in the first half. He's cheap enough that Jalen Wright is a fine play if he's not going to get much ownership, which he is being projected for just 3% at RotoGrinders. So at 1,400, considering the usage, 9 and 5 carries the past couple of weeks, he's just 1,400. If you told me right now that he was going to get 5 carries at 1,400, I would want to be above 3%. I think I'd probably want like 10% of Jalen Wright, because one of those carries could be a touchdown and pays off this price tag immediately. And if you told me he was going to have 9 carries, I would want Jalen Wright in just about all of my lineups at 1,400. So I think that he is a fairly strong play, somebody that I'll probably try to get to 10, 15% of if he is active. Now, that's something you will need to keep an eye on Sunday morning, because again, he was a surprise inactive 2 weeks ago, and you just never know what they're going to do. But my assumption is that he's going to play, and I'm going to be above the field if the field is going to be at 3% on Jalen Wright. Ollie Gordon has had a lot more opportunities than Jalen Wright on the season. He is 2,400 projected for 4% ownership, and he's the bigger of the backs here. Maybe still more likely to see some goal line work on the season, 50% to each of Devin Achan and Ollie Gordon. We don't have the raw numbers here, so I don't know if this is one each or 2 each, or what the actual breakdown is. But it's been 50% each so far inside the 5 for Achan and Gordon. With Gordon being slightly more expensive and getting slightly more ownership, I actually lean to Jalen Wright. But if they are both active, if Wright is out, I'll have significant interest in $2,400 Ollie Gordon. But if all 3 are in, I think Gordon still a fairly strong play at 4%. I think I would come in over that number, slightly into Wright, just because of the ownership and salary. And I'm not convinced that Gordon actually has a better role than Wright at this point, that he should even be projected better if they are both in. But again, we have a really small sample size here. What I like about both is that they do have awesome contingent upside. If anything were to happen to Devin Achan, or in the case of a blowout, they have multiple paths to being more involved. So I like both of the backup running backs quite a bit here on the Dolphins relative to the low ownership numbers. And I would absolutely be willing to play 2 running backs from the Dolphins in the same lineup. Whether I would play 3, I'm not sure that I would need to get to 3 in the same lineup. I'm not totally opposed to it, just because we don't have really strong options in this game. But 2 for sure, I'd be willing to play in the same lineup. At receiver, starting with the Commanders, we have 5 viable options in Deebo Samuel, Robbie Chosen, Jalen Lane, Chris Moore, and Jacoby Jones. As far as the matchup goes, it is not a great one with Miami. It is the 7th worst in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers over the past 5 weeks. So not ideal spot for the receivers on the Commanders. Deebo Samuel is still going to look pretty good at 9,600. Now you can see the projection for Deebo, not great. 12.6 relative to, Marcus Mariota is at 17.1 projection. He's only $200 more expensive. And then you've got Devin Achan at 26, Tua at 18.4, Waddle at 18.4. So relative to other more expensive options, Deebo does stand out for being kind of a negative value at 9,600. But as far as the wide receivers go on the Commanders, he is the clear lead receiver here. In 9 games played, he missed the game, unfortunately, against the Cowboys. But in 9 games played, 60 targets for Deebo on 78.7% route participation. Also does have 10 carries in 9 games, so just over 1 carry per game for Deebo Samuel. Deebo being projected for 31% flex ownership and 5% captain ownership. I think it's enough ownership going into Deebo Samuel that in the flex, I anticipate I'll actually be underweight, and 5% captain, I would like to be about with the field, maybe even above the field at 5%, just because he does, I think, still have the ability to put up a big score, and he's the most likely of the Commanders receivers, at least. So I'm okay with 5% captain ownership. I think that where I would get away from the ownership on Deebo is this 31% flex. We just have stronger options, including, Waddle is just getting 6% more ownership. We'll get to talking about Waddle, but he's going to look a bit better, project significantly better than Deebo Samuel. And we've got some other fairly strong options. So ultimately, I suspect I'll be a bit underweight on Deebo, again, just because you look at the projection relative to the price. He's a really weak value, and the ownership doesn't fully reflect that currently. So I will likely be underweight on Deebo overall. Deebo is kind of the only sure thing on the Commanders. Beyond Deebo, again, like I said, we have Robbie Chosen, Jalen Lane, Chris Moore, and Jacoby Jones. We can take a look at the route participation for the Commanders, and it's kind of tough to get your head around what things might look like this week, because we saw Treylon Burks kind of ascending in his role from 37% in week 9, 50% route participation in week 10. He hurt his finger. Treylon Burks is inactive this week. So then you have to figure out what we're doing with the other receivers here. We'd seen Chris Moore drop from 74% route participation down to 19 in week 10. Robbie Chosen came back to the team and ran 27% of routes in week 10. Jalen Lane down from 57% to 23% in week 10. Just kind of a mess here. So we'll do our best to figure out what to do with these receivers. And both sites have Robbie Chosen as the second best projected receiver on the Commanders, which is probably right. We'll take a look at it. Chosen just 2,200. Run the Sims hasn't projected for 4.6 fantasy points. Roto Grinders has Robbie Chosen projected for 6.73 fantasy points, which at 2,200 looks like a really strong value. And then he's being projected for 23% ownership as a result. Just looking like a relatively strong value at 2,200. We did see Chosen in week 7 ran 55% of routes. That was with Deebo out. We saw pretty good participation. And then in week 10, 27% route participation for Robbie Chosen. That was last week. In that game, again, it was a blowout. So if we break it down by quarter, kind of promising that he ran more in the first half, but honestly, not that much. It was not that many routes. 3 routes in the first quarter, 1 in the second, 2 in the third, and then just 1 route in the fourth quarter of that blowout for Robbie Chosen. So not exactly really strong route participation in week 10. Again, ultimately came down to just 27% of routes. But we do think that with Treylon Burks out this week, probably Robbie Chosen benefits, particularly just because if we look at the trends with the other receivers, it doesn't look all that promising. So I think it makes sense to have Robbie Chosen projected the next best after Deebo. How well he should project, it's been kind of gross. I mean, just looking at the route participation, we haven't had anybody consistent outside of Deebo and Zach Ertz, obviously. But then outside of those two, it's like Chris Moore dropped significantly in terms of route participation. Jalen Lane dropped significantly in terms of route participation. And this is with Luke McCaffrey out as well. Luke McCaffrey got hurt in week 9. So we saw Luke McCaffrey out in week 10, and we still saw big drops for Jalen Lane and Chris Moore. Seems like the team is kind of experimenting with who they might want to play out there. But it's really tough to predict the Commanders. But I think it makes sense for Robbie Chosen to be the next best projection after Deebo. If he's going to be chalky, as he is being projected to be kind of chalky, I don't love it. I think he's a fine play if he's at 10% ownership. I think I'd want to have more than 10%, but at 23%, I think I'll be under the field. Maybe I'll be close to the field, just because I don't have any real confidence that it is going to be Robbie Chosen as the second best option here. So yeah, I think projection wise looks fine, but not a player that I'm highly prioritizing at 22% ownership. Jalen Lane, even tougher to get to at 4,400, projects worse than Robbie Chosen. As we just saw, Jalen Lane seen his route participation drop down to 23% in week 10. So not really promising from that standpoint. Breaking it down by quarter for Jalen Lane, we can't really gain much from it because he went 2 routes in the first, 1 in the second quarter, 2 in the third, 1 in the fourth. So, if you want to follow that pattern, it's not great getting three routes per half for Jalen Lane. Just 1 target in the game. That was in the second quarter on his 1 route run. In terms of ownership, Jalen Lane being projected for 15% flex ownership. That doesn't excite me. I think I'd rather be underweight there. I think there are better plays than Jalen Lane at 4,400. Now, if he does get back to the route participation of 57% from week 9 or 73% in week 7, then that would intrigue me at 4,400. But just given the trend, I don't love it at 15% ownership. I suspect I'll be underweight to Jalen Lane and try to find some better value elsewhere. But we can't find that better value with Chris Moore, who is 2,000. And again, just looking at the trends here, Chris Moore down to 19% route participation in week 10. And he actually seemed to have benefited from the blowout. Chris Moore in the first quarter ran just 1 route, didn't run a single route in the second quarter last week, ran 1 in the third, and then in the fourth quarter of a blowout, ran 3 routes, which was 50% of the routes for the Commanders. So not really involved at all in the first quarter. I was kind of wondering, looking at the route participation, if maybe this was a result of an injury to Chris Moore or something, but no, it was kind of the opposite. He was not involved at all in the first half. Seems like the team not loving it. I know he was dealing with some drops at one point. So the team seems to have decided that he is not the guy, and he really just got involved in the fourth quarter. So Moore does not seem to be a really strong play. He is projected for just 6% ownership, and he's just 2,000. So I think I actually like it better than Lane just because he is only 2,000 and getting lower ownership, but still not a priority for him. It's still just kind of you have to hope for a touchdown, hope for things to continue to get wonky in his favor, I guess, in terms of the route participation. But there's nothing in the trends to give us any hope for Chris Moore. Jacoby Jones actually kind of intriguing at 200. He has not played yet this season, but again, he is just 200. Not being projected for much ownership, just 2% projected ownership for Jacoby Jones. And again, he has not played this year, which I actually think is kind of bullish that they signed him off of the practice squad this week. They clearly don't like what they have at wide receiver. They're not satisfied with the production that they've been getting from their active receivers. If they're giving Treylon Burks 50% of the routes, that's a pretty big indictment on the rest of the receivers here. As we've seen Jalen Lane and Chris Moore kind of lose opportunities, it wouldn't really be that surprising if it's Jacoby Jones who's running the second most routes on of the receivers outside of Deebo Samuel. Now, is that the most likely scenario? No, I'm not trying to suggest that he is the likely wide receiver 2 here. All I'm saying is it doesn't seem that the team is super confident in the receivers that they have behind Deebo Samuel and obviously Terry McLaurin right now. Kind of seems like they're experimenting. So they just signed him off the practice squad. Just given the $200 price tag and the lack of ownership on Jacoby Jones, I think he's a pretty strong play at 200. Actually, I think I like him the second best of the receivers on the Commanders after Deebo Samuel. Not somebody that I have a ton of confidence in that I want to play in 40% of my lineups, but I think having 10% of Jacoby Jones and being 5x the field is something that I might actually do, and just understand that I might be taking big zeros there, but I also have outs in terms of if they're blown out again for the 5th game in a row, maybe that's when Jacoby Jones get in, if they're or maybe he's involved early on. So I think that there are outs there. I actually think he's a really strong contrarian play at 200 in a wide receiver core that is just kind of in flux. With that said, we're going to have to pay attention to inactives because it's very possible that one of these receivers on the Commanders is inactive on game day. And then obviously we can reassess with that news. But if we have all 5 of them active, that's how I break it down. Deebo is the one that I'm going to have the most of. I think that he is, the only safe option of the receivers here. I still think that he is too expensive for his role. So I'm still going to be underweight likely on Deebo in the flex. And then beyond Deebo, I don't really love any of these other receivers. Jacoby Jones would be my second favorite for large field GPPs, although the likeliest outcome is that he is a 0. Beyond Deebo and Jacoby Jones, I would say my third favorite is RB Chase. I think he's probably the safest option beyond Deebo, also getting the most ownership. I think he's fine at around 23% ownership. I suspect I'll be slightly underweight to that. I'll definitely be underweight to Jalen Lane if he's going to get 15% ownership. And then Chris Moore at 6% seems fine at 2,000, but not a big priority. On the Dolphin side, the team has played 6 games without Tyreek Hill at this point. Jalen Waddle looking like an alpha receiver. Behind Jalen Waddle, you've got Malik Washington, and then a little bit of a gap down to Nick Westbrook-Ikhine and Cedric Wilson and Taj Washington. In terms of the matchup, it's a really strong one for Dolphins receivers. Fourth best matchup against the Commanders in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position over the past 5 weeks. So everything looks good for the Dolphins. With that said, you can see just looking at the chart here, much better for slot receivers than anybody else on the team. A plus 7.3 matchup for slot receivers, minus 4.5 for receivers on the left, plus 1.7 for receivers on the right. So you want to look at who is running the slot routes on the Dolphins. I will just pull that up. In terms of the routes run since Tyreek Hill went down, Taj Washington running half of his from the slot. Malik Washington 49% from the slot, so he'll benefit the most from the matchup. Westbrook-Ikhine 43%, Darren Waller 41%, Greg Dulcich 36%, D. Eskridge 29%. He is questionable, likely to miss this game. Tanner Connor 27%, Jalen Waddle all the way down at 21%. So from a matchup standpoint, in that sense, not a great matchup for Jalen Waddle, despite being a great matchup for receivers, because it's a better matchup for slot receivers, and Jalen Waddle just not lining up from the slot at all this year. It's not enough to scare me off of Jalen Waddle. He's been really good, even in some bad matchups. Looking at the route participation, Waddle has been fairly consistent, 75, 77, 76% the past 3 weeks. The schematic matchup doesn't pop, but it is better for Jalen Waddle than it is for the other receivers on the team. Slightly better than Malik Washington, much better than Nick Westbrook-Ikhine in terms of the schematic matchup in the wide receiver coverage matchup matrix. And perhaps most importantly, Jalen Waddle at 10,600 projected for 37% ownership at flex, and at captain being projected for 12.5% ownership. So I think Waddle looks like a really, really strong play. Again, being projected for under 50% total ownership at a relatively reasonable price tag. He's much cheaper than Devin Achane, a bit more expensive than Tua, more expensive than Debo, the other options here, and Marcus Mariota, but still a reasonable price tag and only getting to about 50% ownership. So I think Waddle looks like a really strong play here. That 12.5% at captain, I think I'll probably be overweight on that number for Waddle. Again, just projects pretty well, has had a really strong role without Tyreek Hill. And we don't have a lot of great pay up options on this slate. It's kind of Devin Achane is in a tier of his own. And then beyond Achane, it's kind of a mix of, do you want to play the quarterbacks? Do you want to play Waddle? Do you want to play Debo Samuel? And I think I would have Waddle as, I'd probably have Tua as my second favorite, followed by Waddle, and then Mariota and Debo being the least favorite, just because he is projects kind of poorly, and he's still getting a fair amount of ownership. So kind of tough to figure out who you want to play of the spend ups. But Waddle would be, I think, my second or third favorite of the group after Achane. After Waddle would be Malik Washington, the next best option on the Dolphins. He's 6,200, projects for over 9 fantasy points, projecting for 22% ownership in the flex. At captain, Malik Washington also getting 3% ownership. I think those ownership numbers are totally fine. He's being played by about a quarter of the field. Again, we looked at it. He's running about half his routes from the slot, which is a strong matchup for receivers. He's also had a fairly strong role since Tua Tagovailoa went down. Malik Washington, 28 targets, second on the team in targets in those 6 games, on 62% route participation. So over 4 targets per game for Malik Washington. So not a really high number, but over 4 is not nothing. He's honestly a little bit too expensive for receivers, getting 4 targets per game. But this is a slate where that's better than it is on a lot of slates, because we don't have a lot to have confidence in on this slate. So you factor in the matchup with slot receivers looks really good for Malik Washington. Again, he's a little bit too expensive, but most players on this slate are a bit too expensive. I think he looks fine getting that 25% ownership. I don't think I'll have any more than that. I don't think it looks like a really strong play. Looking at the route participation, it's been kind of all over the place, but 57% week 8, 67% 9, 57%. So fairly strong. He looks like a reasonable play to me, not like any kind of big priority. And then you have Nick Westbrook-Ikhine getting 1% captain ownership, 15% flex ownership at 3,000. I actually think I'm more likely to get above weight on Westbrook-Ikhine than I am Malik Washington. just due to the lower ownership and less than half the price. Looking at the usage since Tyreek Hill went down, just 13 targets for Nick Westbrook-Ikine, but 56% route participation. We've seen in the past the ability to break off some long plays. The ADOT fairly low so far with the Dolphins, but I think he looks okay at 3,000. Just a touchdown likely gets you there with Westbrook-Ikine, whereas it doesn't necessarily for Malik Washington at his price tag, and lesser ownership for Westbrook-Ikine. So I think he looks like a fairly strong play at 15% ownership. Not like a huge priority, but somebody I'll work in. And then beyond those top three, it's Cedric Wilson and Taj Washington. Just looking at the trends recently, Washington 19 and 14% route participation, and then Wilson 25% down to 7 and 9.5 the past couple games. I don't see any reason to expect that to change. I think both are just kind of not out there enough to be priorities. I think you can mix them in if you want to. You're kind of hoping for a touchdown for either one of them. Over the past 6 games, it's been Cedric Wilson just 2 targets on 13% route participation, Taj Washington 2 targets on 13% route. So really similar route participation. We do get D Eskridge out for this game, so that's maybe a slight bump for these receivers, but I'm not expecting much for the 4th and 5th receiver for the Dolphins. As far as the ownership goes, that would obviously make a difference in terms of prioritizing. Cedric Wilson at 200 projected for 4% ownership. Because they're 200, I think they're both kind of fine. Taj projected for 2%. So I think both are like relatively strong, mix them in kind of plays. I'll probably be above weight on 2% Taj Washington, maybe also on 4% Cedric Wilson. I think those are relatively nice price tag and ownership numbers. So I will play some. You have more confidence in the role of those two than you do in Jacoby Jones. I think Jacoby Jones probably has more upside to surprise and just see suddenly a bigger role, just because these guys have been kind of steady in their roles. But I think the floor is higher, at least the floor in terms of usage is higher for those two. So I think that they're probably fine plays, and I'll probably be above weight just slightly on both Cedric Wilson, and Taj Washington. At tight end on the Commanders, you've got Zach Ertz in a nice matchup with the Dolphins. It is the 4th best matchup for tight ends against the Dolphins over the past 5 weeks in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. Ertz is 5,800. He is getting a lot of ownership, 9% projected captain ownership going to Ertz and 29% in the flex. So nearly 40% ownership going to Ertz. He does have a strong role, just looking at the role on the season for Ertz. 48 targets, so 4.8 targets per game on 72% route participation. I think he looks like a fairly strong play, probably a better play than Malik Washington in a vacuum. He is getting more ownership than Malik Washington, just kind of the same price point just about for those two is why I'm comparing them. But it's a nice matchup, and he does get targeted more. So I do like Ertz. I don't know that I'm going to have 9% at captain. That seems like a bit much. But overall, getting to somewhere in the 30s of Zach Ertz exposure, I think makes sense. I don't really have much else to say about Ertz. Then you've got John Bates and Ben Sinnott. Ben Sinnott is questionable. He's been hurt. It's possible that he plays in this game. Would probably benefit Bates if he does not go. Bates we saw up to 34.6% route participation last week. Sinnott at 23.1%. I guess this is another way the Commanders could go if they're not trusting any of their receivers outside of Debo. Maybe they just continue to lean on the tight ends. I guess that's an angle you could play, is maybe they look better. The tight ends look better because the receivers have been so bad. Looking at the ownership numbers, Bates being projected for 4% ownership, and then you have Sinnott projected for 2%. Again, that'll probably change depending on what happens. If Sinnott plays, he'd look good at 2%. Bates would look pretty good at 4. I mean, at 4% at 1,000, Bates is going to look pretty great regardless. The floor is, of course, 0 for both. Let's take a look at just week 10 here. Bates in week 10, 4 routes run in the first quarter, 2 in the second, 1 in the third, 2 in the fourth. So I think that's pretty strong. Seen 6 routes run in the first half of the last game for Bates. Sinnott saw similar. I mean, two routes run in the first quarter and the fourth quarter, and then 1 in the second and third. So we don't really see any kind of trend there for Sinnott, but I think a positive trend there for John Bates. Maybe somebody we can think about playing there. Um, and then in terms of the targets in that game, Sinnott was targeted just once in the fourth quarter. Bates was targeted twice in the first quarter and then wasn't targeted for the rest of the game. So, I mean, at low ownership, I think Bates is a fairly strong play, especially if now maybe we see the route participation continue to go up for a team that doesn't really trust their receivers. If Sinnott plays and he's getting 2% ownership, I think he's a fairly strong play at 600, kind of the classic backup tight end where you're just kind of hoping for one reception at that price tag. And if it's a touchdown, then you're feeling great about it. Neither of them like slam dunks, but at low ownership, I would want to be above weight, particularly on John Bates. I think it's a pretty good bet just based on the trending up the past couple weeks for John Bates. But the best tight end play is going to be on the Dolphin side, where you have Greg Dulcich at 2,800 being projected for 19% flex ownership. Dulcich also getting 4% ownership at captain. It's a fine matchup in terms of schedule adjusted. It's the 12th best matchup for tight ends over the past 5 weeks. So not bad matchup for Dulcich. But really what it comes down to is he's had pretty good usage. And his role is kind of growing over time. You can see Dulcich, the route participation increasing quickly from 25% in his first game in week 8. The team talked about wanting to get him more involved as he gets used to the team. 44% in week 9, and then up to 76% route participation in week 10 for Greg Dulcich. The targets up from 0 in week 8 to 5 targets in week 9, and then 3 targets in week 10. But overall, I mean, we'll take that kind of usage for a $2,800 tight end in Greg Dulcich. So he just looks pretty great here. And then behind Dulcich, you've got Julian Hill, Hayden Rucci. In terms of the route participation, Julian Hill has been out, so his return could theoretically cut into Dulcich somewhat, but I'm not that concerned about it just because Dulcich has been kind of a priority for the offense in recent weeks. Rucci did run 4.8% of routes. If Julian Hill returns, I think there's a good chance that Rucci is just inactive. If he's active, I guess at 200, he could be a dart throw. Not my favorite, but maybe somebody to mix into a 150 set. But yeah, Dulcich would be the priority Hill here. Hill playable at 1600, just kind of hoping for a touchdown, and then Rucci just kind of a 150 set dart throw. Kickers and defenses, Matt Gay is 4,800, being projected for 23% ownership. I think that's totally fine. Riley Patterson, 5,000, projected for 27% ownership. I like that a bit less. So if I'm splitting hairs, I guess I'd prefer Gay at lower ownership and a lower price tag. I don't have real strong takes on the kickers, but I think somewhere in that 20 to 30% range is probably where I want to be. I really like the defenses better than the kickers, though. Overall, I think my favorite play of the kickers and defenses, Commanders defense at 3,600, being projected for 17% ownership. Not the strongest defense, but the matchup with Tua and the Dolphins pretty strong for the Commanders. The price is nice and the ownership is low. So I think in order of my preference, it would be Commanders defense number one. Dolphins defense against Marcus Mariota also looks pretty strong. So they'd be number two for me, followed by Matt Gay, followed by Patterson. So it's kind of in inverse order of the ownership is how I would prefer the kickers and defenses. Finally, because Run the Sims is not set up yet, and I'm making this on a Friday, I'm just going to play around with making a couple lineups here. So I'm playing the largest field contests, and I'm just going to throw in some of the players that I like the best. See what I can make with a lineup just for the fun of it. I'm not recommending that you play these lineups. I'm just going to try to experiment with what I might want to try. So I do think that in a vacuum, Devin Achan, like if I was playing a single entry, he would probably be the captain that I go to. He just projects so much better than everybody else. He is my favorite. My second favorite spend up is Tua Tagovailoa, and I want to make sure I get some projection in there. So I'm going to throw Tua in there. I think that he, suits a lineup with Achan at captain quite well. And from there, you do need to start finding some value. I do like Chris Rodriguez as kind of a lower owned play who has big upside at 6,600. So I would throw Chris Rodriguez into this lineup. And then I'll look for some stronger values. Again, Greg Dulcich at 2,800 just stands out as a great value here. I do like Jalen Wright a bit at 1,400. So I think I'll throw Jalen Wright into the lineup and just hope that he gets, 5, 7 carries. And then I've got 10,900 left over to throw in Jalen Waddle. There you go. That looks like a great 5-1 Miami onslaught to me. That's the kind of lineup that I like to play. Now, this one only leaves 300 on the table, so might run into dupe concerns with this lineup. Could, if I wanted to get away from that, I could, maybe replace Jalen Wright with a Jacoby Jones leaves 1,500 on the table. Maybe looks less likely to be duped in a large field contest. Certainly, that would look better from that perspective. Not going to project quite as well and less likely to hit, but that's another kind of pivot that I could make there. But yeah, these look like the types of lineups that I like, and fit in a lot of great plays with HN a captain. But then if I were going to get into, making 5 entries and I wanted to make one without HN at captain, then I would consider going to, it'd probably be Tua or Waddle would be my second favorite as far as captains go. I'll try one with Tua, which is a bit easier. Still throw HN in there. I think I would still, now I want to be at least double stacked here. I think I can kind of do a similar lineup though. I can throw in Waddle and throw in Greg Dulcich, just playing some of the hits here, some of my favorite plays. And then I have 9,400. So then I could play, well, I couldn't fit Debo in here. I could throw in Chris Rodriguez again. Could mega stack it with Malik Washington. Now this is tough. Maybe I throw in a defense. So maybe I throw in the Commanders defense. And then I have Zachary. That one would definitely be duped if I do this. I think it's pretty likely to be duped. It does have the, pulls the lever of Tua captain against the Commanders defense, which a lot of people won't want to do. So it's possible that this one not like super duped, but it's using the full salary, pretty good chance that it's going to get some dupes in there. I wonder if there's a different direction I could go. So maybe instead of Dulcich, I could go even cheaper if I then could get to, again, I don't love Debo Samuel at his price tag, but he's somebody I could consider. So if I put Debo in there, then I could still get to something like Jalen Wright and John Bates, or again go down to the one of those mega cheap options, Jacoby Jones or Cedric Wilson. One of those, maybe Cedric Wilson since it's to a stack, or Todd Washington, kind of the same play. I don't really have a strong preference between Washington and Cedric Wilson, but I'll throw Cedric Wilson in there. That one leaves 1,000 on the table. Probably not super likely to be duped. So that's kind of a fun large field tournament option. And then maybe I would just experiment with, I do kind of want to try a Chris Rodriguez captain lineup. So I put C-Rod in there and just hope that he has that big game. Then I have 8,000 left over for my remaining picks. Could put in Malik Washington, save a little value. Now I'm going to be able to pay up for, again, the big 3 that are my favorite, HN, Waddle, Tua. Still leaves 1,100 left over. And there I could fit in a John Bates potentially, or leave a little salary on the table, again, with somebody like Jacoby Jones, who, again, fairly likely to be a 0, but leaves 900 on the table, and maybe the team wants to experiment with other receivers there. So there's another potential large field type contest type lineup. All right, that's going to be it for this video. If you haven't done so, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. If you're interested in checking out the Flannelverse Discord, that's free to join. There's a link in the description of this video. I think that's all I've got to say, other than good luck on Sunday, everybody. Let's hope that somebody can take this down, win some money, and let me know if you do. I always love to hear from people. If you do win some money and you think that you got something out of this video that helped you get there, let me know. I always appreciate hearing it. All right, thanks everybody.